And we are ready to now rock and roll. Magnus opens with 1 e4. He has 1 hour 23 minutes on the clock since he's arrived 7 minutes late to the game. And Maghsoodloo plays the Karo Khan. It's going to be very exciting here. And now Magnus trying to figure what's the next move. He goes d4 here. Karo Khan is a very solid opening, but when it comes to like absolute solid openings, it's much less than e4, e5. So Magnus plays the most testing system, the advanced variation in the Karo Khan. Bishop f5 played here by Maghsoodloo, and this is bound to be a very complex game. Knight d2, and the idea of this move is to put your knight on b3 to stop the pawn from coming to c5 at a later point. e6 by Maghsoodloo. You can see how he has developed the bishop outside his pawn chain, and now if he can make c5 happen, he would be very happy, but Magnus instantly stops it. Well, you can still play c5 technically, because takes, bishop takes, knight takes, there's check and you can win, but then you lose your bishop pair. So Maghsoodloo prepares it. He's going knight d7 for now, and c5 is on the card somewhere. Magnus just develops his knight. The problem is that if you play c5 dc, you still can't take here, because after take there is bishop b5 check, and you might have to lose your castling rights. So knight e7. Black is very calm and patient, tries to get all his pieces developed. And now Magnus plays bishop e2. Simple move, trying to get his king castled. Maghsoodloo now has a few questions to solve. One idea is bishop g6 and knight f5, opening this bishop, but he goes h6, and this is also a very logical move. Drop the bishop back, bring the knight out is the maybe the way to go. White castles, and now how should black continue here is the question. Maghsoodloo brings his bishop back to h7, and later he wants to put his knight out on f5, or maybe knight g6, maybe g5 is on the cards, and Magnus starts expanding on the other side now, a4, and he plans to go a5 to clamp down even further. Black plays the move a5 to keep the space equal on the queen side. But this pawn on a5, you have to be careful, because you could see how Magnus is ganging up on it with bishop d2, knight b3, all are attacking here. In fact, this game is following the game of Vidit Gujarati against his Icelandic opponent. Queen b6 played. Maghsoodloo's queen on b6 I feel is slightly misplaced. Rook c1, and this has a very nice point, because you want to defend the c2 pawn. Later you will go queen e1 and try to attack a5. That's possible, but g5 played here, and maybe g4 is somewhere on the cards, but white can go c4. He goes king h1, and is Magnus preparing, like if you go g4, does he want to go knight g1? Not really. Maybe he still has the h4 square, but knight g6 played here by Maghsoodloo. Maybe now g4 does become small threat. Bishop d3 played. And if you still play g4, I can now go knight g1 or even knight e1, and I'm fine. Parham plays his bishop to b4, and he's ready to trade the pieces here. If bishop takes, he would be happy with some exchanges. After all, black has less space in the position, but Magnus is in no mood to trade. He goes bishop e3. He improves the position of his bishop. And now the queen comes back to c7. And knight comes back to d2. Well, the plan that white has in this position is to go for c4 break, but also there is f4, and black's king does not know where to go. So actually Parham's position strategically is very risky here. And Magnus just what he wanted out of this game, a complex game. Firstly, a pair of bishops are traded, rook takes h7, and then c3 followed by c4 could be the plan that white can go for now. Yes, he plays his pawn to c3. and brings his bishop back here. And pushes his pawn even further. Pawn to c4 played. Black under some pressure here. Parham now going knight f8. He's trying to move his pieces, maneuver them some way. Knight g6 may be on the cards. And does white really want to go f4 now? That would be something, because you are having pressure down the c file. And you also open up the f file. Magnus thinks for a bit and plays it. f4 on the board. The rook is opening up here. The queen has opened up. Can go to h5. f7 spot can become a big weakness. I'm not sure if Parham really likes his position at this point. He goes knight f5, which is a good move. Attacking the bishop, also putting pressure on the pawn. But Magnus very calmly had played king h1 a few moves ago, remember? So he can just drop his bishop back to g1. And he does it. Bishop g1. Magnus has 29 minutes on the clock. Parham has 47 minutes. Pawn takes pawn. And perhaps now cd is the right timing, because you can't take back with the c pawn. You have to take back with the e pawn. And he takes. Once you take with the e pawn, the knight on f5 is not very stable. So ed, and now we can take here. Rook takes f4, attacking the knight. The knight has to move. The only silver lining that black has in this otherwise colorless position is that the e6 square is beautiful for the knight. It will sit there and attack everything. Both the knights are although fighting for it. And Magnus goes queen c2, attacking the rook. But the rook is defended for the time being. So maybe knight e6 is a good idea. He plays h5. Parham is a very ambitious player in general, and I don't know if what he feels about his position. Magnus goes rook f1, but maybe knight f1 to knight e3 could have been another plan there. Knight e6 played, attacking the rook. The rook has to move. Maybe rook f5. Yes, he plays his rook to f5 now. So Parham has kind of made his position a little secure with all these pieces, and he plays queen b6, trying to put some pressure on the d4 pawn here with his knight. And also Magnus goes knight b1. Very interesting move. Maybe he just wants to play knight c3 here. But there's pressure on d4. Is some pressure on b3. Pawn moves forward to h4, and Magnus stops it in its tracks with h3. Parham goes rook g7. He's keeping a very simple strategy. He's improving the position of his rook. The strategy is that keep improving your pieces all the time, and if you do that, even though your position is bad, it will improve a little bit. It will become a little less bad. Bishop g5 played. Now an interesting move could be knight c5 to get rid of this knight. Also the bishop is a little bit soft here, so knight c5 is definitely an idea to think about. He goes knight to d2. Maybe Magnus is planning just knight f3, improving the position of his knight. Queen a6, very interesting. Keeping an eye on the rook. If you play knight f3, a blunder, you will lose the rook. So rook 1, f3 played. And Parham now brings his rook to d8. May be useful later on to defend the f7 pawn with rook d7. The knight comes back to f1. This knight could go to e3, but it could also go to h2 to g4. Rook d7. And Magnus is improving his position. Knight h2, another nice move. Black does not have many active plans, but Parham comes in. He's like, now I'm attacking your pawn on d4 here. So that is my plan. And will Magnus defend it? He goes b3. This is such a beautiful move. Because if you play here, knight takes d4. Then there is this amazing move, queen f2. and knight b3, you just go knight g4 with a massive attack, and that's why Parham goes queen b4 and Magnus plays his knight back to e2. Knight g6 played. Somehow Parham is quite comfortable with the position he has. He's not worried about his castling or anything. Rook d3 could be an option here that could be played, but he plays knight to g4, and now the problem is knight e7 kind of traps the rook here on f5. Parham seems to have found it. He goes knight f5, attacking the rook here. Rook f6 played, and you can't take here because after ef6 there's a fork of two pieces, so the rook sits for the time being pretty okay there. And Parham now finds the best move amidst the mess. He wants to trade the queens, and the queens have to be traded, otherwise you will lose the knight. So takes, bishop takes, and now the bishop is played to e3. He's trying to trade off this dark squared bishop, and Parham now chops it off. Bishop takes bishop, and Magnus thinking a bit whether he should take with the knight here or the rook. He takes with the rook. Black's position has improved considerably after these exchanges, especially of the queen. Pawn to c5. Parham is starting to get active now. If you take here, he would start pushing his central pawn. So take, pawn to d4, attacking the rook, and the rook comes to d3, blocking the pawn. If you take now on c5, I'll take the pawn on d4. So he plays first knight c6, defending the pawn and now attacking the pawn on c5, but also keeping an eye on the e5 pawn. And Magnus sacks the exchange there. Rook takes e6 has happened. F takes e6. The position has been so complex and weird. It's very difficult to wrap your mind around it as to what exactly happened. King f8. He takes the rook. Rook takes, and now Parham is doing pretty well here in this position. He's pawn down, but everything is quite okay for him. His knight, rook, everyone's well placed. g3 by Magnus, trying to create some play. He plays king g8, just a useful move, and wanting to come maybe later on this side to win those pawns. So Magnus does win another pawn. He's now 2 pawns up, but the h pawn qualitatively are not so great. Rook d5 play, that's a good move. He's threatening rook takes e5, rook takes c5, and the pawns cannot be saved. So Magnus brings his king up, king g2. These are the kinds of positions Magnus loves to grind, and it's very difficult to escape from his claws once he starts to play this way. King h7 by Parham. Rook d2, he brings his rook back. And pawn takes. Rook takes pawn. But now we can take the pawn in the center here. Knight takes d4. Magnus takes. And Parham goes into the rook endgame. Knight takes d4. Rook takes d4. And now you can simply win this pawn, but instead of winning it, he goes b5. Very useful move, because he's trading down the pieces, trading down the pawns. King f3. Rook takes e5. Magnus offers a trade of rooks. Of course, taking this would lead to a disaster. White is completely winning here. So he moves his rook with a check. Goes king e3. And now Parham takes the pawn. B takes on a4. He takes back ba. And rook h5 played. The thing is, Magnus has an extra pawn, but they are doubled. So in a way, that extra pawn doesn't matter. But his small edge here is that the pawns which are doubled are outside passers. So that means that black has to be careful. Meanwhile, this passer is a little bit closer to the other pawn on a file. So if ever these pawns are traded for these two, then black would be in trouble because the white king would be very close, like here, king c4. And now the last game of the match is left between Magnus and Parham. Iran is already leading the match with a score of 2-1, which means that Magnus is in a must win if he has to equalize the scores. This is not a happy situation to be in. King comes back. He plays rook h5. And now Magnus is thinking what to do next. He plays his rook to e4, attacking the pawn on e6. Now if you play e5, that would be a mistake. It kind of interferes with the action of the rook. So king g7 is the best move, and Parham finds it, because now after rook takes e6, you have takes here, attacking the pawn here and here. So king f3 by Magnus. He's still trying his best. Magnus is known to grind equal positions, equal endgames. King f6. Now king g4, attacking the rook. The rook goes back. And now Magnus should start pushing his pawn anyway, h-pawn, because I don't think it will go very far, but something. Instead he gives a check. And Parham goes king g6. He keeps his king close to his pawn there. And Magnus now plays rook e6. This defends the pawn, and now the h-pawn starts to move forward. h5 is on the board. Parham being very careful here, because a draw would mean his team wins, which is a big result for Iran to beat Norway. King f3. He plays his rook to g5. He's attacking the pawn on h5. And I think Magnus defends it, threatening h6, h7, h8. King goes back. And now comes a check. In order to tie the king up on the h7 square and then attack the pawn on e6. So now you can go rook e4 to attack the e6 pawn. And he does it. He goes here. But I think you can take. Oh, he didn't take. He played rook h5. He's now attacking this pawn. And Magnus can now defend it, which he does. Rook takes pawn. And he defends the pawn on e6. Very interesting. Rook e5. So Magnus is going after the a pawn. Parham gives a check. King f4. And another check. The king goes back. And another check. Parham doing this well. He's actually a very experienced player, and he of course knows that this is a draw, because For anyone else who's not very experienced, this position against Magnus can definitely be some pressure. Rook f6. Now Magnus finally chops off the pawn on a5. He gives a check. Not a check. He plays rook f3, cuts the king off, and wants to put the rook the other side. So Magnus also cuts the black king off. It's all about cutting off your opponent's king's activity. Rook a3, putting the rook behind the passed pawn. And Magnus now pushes the pawn, but it won't go any further because the black rook is well placed. King h6. And Magnus pushes his pawn to h4. Now rook a4 played, attacking the pawn. He goes ahead with the king and defends it. And a check. Another check. And in order to make progress, Magnus may have to give up his h4 pawn, which he does here. And I think Parham should grab it. He takes it. Rook takes h4, not only taking a pawn but also attacking the rook now. Rook e5. And now we have to be very careful because the a pawn is a tricky creature here. King g7, but Parham is very close to a draw. Pushes his pawn to a6. Rook goes back and Magnus takes the final pawn. But this should not be enough because after king f7, the king is running towards the pawn. He goes rook h6 and have to be slightly careful not to go king e7 because then a7 wins. So that's the reason why king g7 was played again. Rook came to b6. King f7, king d3, king e7. Slowly and steadily both kings are making their way to the other side of the board. And they have agreed to a draw here. Parham Maghsoodloo